Okay. All right, I want to hear some signs that have made you chuckle. Anybody got one you want to share? No chucklers out there. There's lots. Whether you want to say them out loud in the room is another question. I appreciate that. Well, I brought some chucklers today. I always get a good laugh. I feel like I just coined a phrase, a chuckler of a sign. I always get a good laugh out of church signs. I went to school, went to college in the South where there was a plethora of church signage, and there was a culture of writing messages on those white signs where you put the little like transparent black letters. And so if you ever want a good chuckle, just Google funny church signs. I brought a few along today, and we'll see if they get a chuckle out of you, okay? Well, first of all, I always forget this. Sermon on the Mount is what we're in. If you would like to follow the resources around, we can leave that QR code up later. But here's a few chuckles. It's okay to fall apart. Tacos do it all the time, and we still love them. I appreciate this. I love tacos, and I love that sign. Don't let worries kill you. Let the church help. I see what they were going for there, but I don't think that they accomplished it. I wish Noah had swatted those 2 mosquitoes. That is like a Minnesota. If that is not in Minnesota, I would be surprised. One more for you here from a preacher. Do you know what hell is? Come hear our preacher. Again, I think I know what they were going for there, but they missed it, I think. Well, that's a funny thing to talk about and a funny little rabbit hole to go down. I show you those and ask you that question because the discussion I want to have today, and here at North City, we try to have things that we say from the microphone at this time in our brunch, set up conversation around your tables so you can be listening for ways that you want to contribute to the conversation. And the conversation, I think a way to frame it today, with the words of Jesus that we're going to look at is, what does the relationship with the church, what is the relationship supposed to be like between the church and the world? What relationship does Jesus hope we as the community of his followers have with the world? I think that's a question we should always be asking. It's a question we've been asking since the church was founded, and there's no one answer to that question. There are answers and responses to that question. So today we're really going to kind of continue that conversation. And the reason I put church signs up there is as you walk through life, as you encounter different churches, different communities of faith that follow Jesus, you're going to find different answers to that question. Different postures towards the world, different relationships that they carry out. They may say one thing about how they should relate with the world, but then they act in a completely different way. And so I want to look at the words of Jesus and keep having that conversation so that we can keep leaning into the leadership of Jesus in our lives as a church, but just as individuals in our relationship with our neighbors and the world around us. So there's 2 words that Jesus gives us in this text today, and I brought illustration or like props for them. He uses the word salt and light. And we're going to look at this morning. So I did not have a lighter, but luckily the park had one. And I'll light this up. So there's our light for this morning, and I'm not going to set that on fire. This is salt. Christian Ann provided that for me. So salt and light. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read Jesus' words where he uses this, and then I'm going to provide maybe some handles for conversation, some things that are going on outside of this text that are helpful for you to understand maybe Jesus' words on another level or layer. And then I want you to talk around your tables what you think this means. And the beautiful thing about Jesus, what I love so much about him, is he is a master teacher. And he'll use images like simple things that we see every day to communicate profound truths. And when he does that, he often has not just one meaning, but a multitude of meanings. And the communication is designed to spark your imagination and think about your encounter with these different elements in daily life and what meaning that sheds on what Jesus is saying. There's a lot more to it, But that's the point. That's how he chooses to communicate. So I'm going to read the text when Jesus mentions these two things, and I want you to be thinking about, just notice in your imagination what stands out to you. What connections are you making with everyday life, with what he's saying? And what does it mean about your relationship with your neighbors and the church, our collective disciples of Jesus, what our relationship is with the world? So let's read this. This is in verse 13 of the Sermon on the Mount, so right after the Beatitudes in some sense. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anyone except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light up a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. So just take a moment to pause, make a mental note or a physical one of what stood out to you, because you can bring that in conversation later. Oh, I didn't finish the text. I should probably do that. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Well, as I said, I want to give you a few handles and then invite you to jump into conversation about this. Salt and light in the Bible, this is not the first time that they've come up. And Jesus doesn't just pull these ideas out of thin air. He is adding more meaning and profound meaning to them. It doesn't mean that what you just thought in your mind might not be a good association or meaning for what he's saying. As I said earlier, that's the design of his communication, to spark those sort of connections. But I want to let you in on a little bit of what he's pulling on in the imagination of his listeners. And basically, one way to sum up the connection between these two things, there's lots of meanings, is the word covenant. Both of these items are related to the covenant that God has made with the world and with the people of Israel. Now, what's covenant? We've used that language quite a bit if you've been around North City, but if you don't understand what that means, it means a committed, loving relationship in the context of Scripture. It means God's commitment to humans and humanity to stick it out, to be committed, and to move towards them in relationship, even when they're not holding up the end of the bargain. So both of these things, salt and light, are a signal or a symbol of the covenant. And I just want to give you two examples of how this is true. I actually just read this story the other night, and there's this remarkable story in deep in the weeds of all the history of the kings of Israel, where there's one of these kings of Judah. It's a time where the kingdom is separated. So there's the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel. And this guy named Abijah, how would I say that? Abijah. Thank you, Hebrew scholar. Abijah stands up on this hill, and he yells this to the Israelites who are not following God, not living up to his commands and decrees. He says, "Don't you know that the Lord, the God of Israel, has given the kingship of Israel to David and his descendants forever by a covenant of salt?" And we might hear that, and I did when I read it. I'm like, am I supposed to understand what that means? A covenant of salt? We don't make covenants of salt. We don't make agreements based on salt. But they did. And the reason they did is salt was just practically a preservative and very valuable in the ancient world to preserve food and all sorts of things. And when they would make a covenant with each other, even in ordinary life, like friendship covenants or deals, they would trade salt with each other. They would give the other person salt as a sign of how serious they were and committed they were to the covenant, to the agreement that they were making, as a sign of preservation. So if you fast forward to what Jesus is saying, he is not only tying into the Davidic covenant, this covenant that is signed in salt, now he's saying, you're that salt of the covenant. People who follow me are a representation of the persistent commitment of God to the people that he loves. That is one meaning that Jesus is certainly tapping into. Now, what's the deal with light? So lots of light images from the very beginning in the Bible, but it's a way that God communicates about how he interacts with the world. And here's two examples from a key text that Jesus is certainly referring to all the book of Isaiah, but particularly these chapters in the 40s. And there's two quotes here I want to read you. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. He's speaking of Israel here, a servant of Israel. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you, and I will make you to be a covenant. I will make you, Israel, to be a covenant in and of itself for the people and a light to the Gentiles. This is where Jesus is drawing on when he's saying that. Later on in Isaiah, the actual image of a city, a light on a hill, is spoken in Isaiah. So Jesus isn't conjuring up that image from his imagination. It's a long-standing image of the people of Israel who follow God and their role in relationship with the world. One more from 49 here. He says, it is too small a thing for you to be my servant to restore the tribes of Jacob and bring back those of Israel I have kept. I will also, so not only will the Israelites do that, but I will also make you a light to the nations, to the Gentiles, that my salvation, here's a cool fact, the Hebrew word for salvation is Yeshua. What does that sound like? Jesus. Jesus' name is salvation. That my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. Isn't it cool how there's so much richness in these images in themselves, but that Jesus is pulling out? So I want to toss it to you in conversation around your table and just add, hey, here's what's standing out to me about what JD is underpinning or what I thought of when I heard this text, and what might this mean for me and my relationship with Jesus or my relationship to the world. And if you're not a follower of Jesus, you're welcome to join in these conversations. They're not exclusive for Christians. You can just talk about what this might mean in your life or what interests you about the words that Jesus is using. So for about the next 10 minutes here, we're going to talk through this text. So let me read it one more time and then send you into groups of like 2 to 3 people. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it out on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Okay, so just turn to 2 to 3 others next to you. We have about 10 minutes to share. What does this mean to be salt and light, or what stands out to you? All right? All right. Well, in a little bit, you're going to have some time to just talk with one other person next to you, but I would love to hear a little bit of what has been said around the room. So if you have the courage to share something you shared or maybe something that you thought was great that someone else shared with the rest of the crew, let's just do that for a few minutes. Just go right ahead. What's something? You were just talking about the plans you have afterwards. I get it. Go ahead, Andrew, from the back. Hey, that's fantastic. I'm going to try to repeat that, but not as awesome for the folks on the internet. Anthony said that the root word of salt is also is related to salary. And yes, I think I can confirm it was used as a form of currency in the ancient world. So appreciate that, Anthony. Awesome. Cody? Oh, you're busting your phones out back there? Nice. Oh, fascinating. Google says salt cannot lose its saltiness. So what is Jesus implying here with the loss of saltiness? Great question. All right, Allison, what do you got? Mixed results. Cody's like, IT guy card. Oh. Ooh. Oh my goodness. Contamination or isolation could potentially, not yet verified by the IT guy, lose the saltiness of salt. George. Oh. Oh, you didn't even see the paper. You just bit right through it. Thanks for that warning. That's good. All right. Here's what I love about what just happened. There was like five or different things that we said that are different angles, perspectives on the beauty of Jesus' word and how he's using this. So I hope that's a kind of overview takeaway that like Scripture is so amazing to engage with for that reason and to engage with together. So I want to bring up this question again. There's lots of different answers to this question, but what does it mean for the church to relate with the world? And I want to introduce you to, I would say, like a modified framework as a way of understanding kind of high-level different approaches of the church to the world and maybe some pitfalls in doing that as maybe an extra layer of integration and thought about what this could mean for you and for us. And so this comes from the work of, I'm going to skip down here, of Christ and Culture, Richard Niebuhr and Leslie Newbigin. So it's my kind of amalgamation of some of this. So these are different responses that Christians engage with the world in. And I think there might even be some crossover with the controversial SALT. Does it lose its saltiness? Church on lockdown from culture. This is my own language. So sometimes the church has response to the world and culture that it is a foreign disease to be avoided. And the response to the world is disgust and separation from the world. That sometimes is, if you're reading between the lines of the church's approaches to different parts of culture, there's almost this fear of being contaminated by the culture. Church fighting culture. So instead of like adverse avoidance, there is this attacking culture, usually throwing truth bombs through Twitter or marching on the street or something like that. And there is this understanding that what it means for us to relate with culture is to fight it, to try to gain power, to influence things. And so this is maybe the root of some culture wars that we hear about in our day and age. The church is trying to fit in. One of the things I want to point out, will try to fit in, where they lose their whole identity because they're just anxious to be accepted or anxious to be relevant, anxious to look like acceptable enough so that others feel comfortable. These are pitfalls that the church can come into. Now, I would say that all of these come maybe from a good impulse in that an acknowledgement that there are things in culture that can damage us. There are things in culture that are unjust, that need to be spoken up against. There are things in which we need to make connections between our convictions and the world's convictions and make it easier for people to get acquainted with Jesus. But when these are pushed to extremes, when they dominate our imagination of how we relate with the world, one of the things I want to point out is that all are more about the church than they are about what God is up to in the world. And most of these come from a place of fear of the world and operating out of fear of culture and that shaping our response. So I want to offer an alternative and one that really animates our identity, our mission, our perspective as a church, and has really shaped mine. And that is transforming through incarnational mission. Here's what I mean by that, because those are some big words. From 1 John 1, from John 1, where it talks about Jesus being sent into the world, we draw an understanding of God as God's very identity is one that's perpetually sent in love towards those who he creates. And so we model ourselves in the same way. And just like it says in John 1, he came to dwell among us. The basis of our relationship with the world as Christians who are in relationship with Jesus is to discern that same call. Where is God calling us to dwell among the world? Not completely apart from, but dwell among and in the midst of the world, just like our Savior Jesus. And in addition to that, we don't just set up camp. We're active. We look for something. And what we're looking for is God's activity. Not how we can argue with the culture necessarily, not how we need to avoid the culture necessarily, though those may be important at times. The primary thing that we need to pay attention to is, what is God doing? God, what are you doing? And how can we respond to this? And I love that you guys argued about whether salt can lose its saltiness. And it sounds like part of the research was if it gets isolated, like if it isolates itself, it might lose some saltiness. And if it gets contaminated, so there's some good warnings in that. But then what's the positive use? George came up to me and said, he said, you need salt for good food. And I think you can't put it any other way. Part of the invitation of Jesus is to follow this call, to dwell among the world, to notice God's activity. And when we respond to those things, man, the flavor of what God created the world to be can really come out. And just like when there's light that enters into the room and you can see the colors and contours of the beauty of what's in that room, the invitation is the same for us as Christians to dwell among the world, to respond to what God is doing, and know that when we do that, the world can come alive and come into color. What do you think about this? So you got about 1 to 2 more minutes here. Just turn to the person next to you and kind of notice what's standing out to you now that we've gone through and talked about this, okay? 1 to 2 minutes, and then the band's going to come up and lead us in some worship.